2:43 in the morning, August 9th, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Chandler gripped the rail of USS Quincy's bridge wing as he stared into the tropical darkness off Guadalcanal. Something was wrong. The flashes he'd seen moments earlier weren't lightning. They couldn't be. Not in that pattern. Not moving that way across the black waters between Savo Island and Florida Island. Then the Japanese searchlights blazed to life, and Chandler knew they were all going to die. In the next 37 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy would hand the United States its worst naval defeat in history. 4 Allied heavy cruisers would slip beneath these warm Pacific waters. More than 1,000 sailors would perish in explosions, fires, and the oil-slicked sea. And the catastrophe would expose failures so fundamental, so preventable, that admirals would spend decades trying to explain how America's technological superiority had meant nothing in the darkness off Savo Island. The story begins 48 hours earlier, when Marines had stormed ashore at Guadalcanal and Tulagi in Operation Watchtower, the first American offensive of the Pacific War. The landings on August 7th had caught the Japanese completely off guard. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, America was attacking, not defending. The Marines seized the nearly completed Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal within hours. Everything seemed to be going perfectly. Too perfectly. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa received word of the American invasion at his headquarters in Rabaul that same morning. The 54-year-old Japanese commander immediately understood the threat. If the Americans established themselves on Guadalcanal, they would have an unsinkable aircraft carrier threatening Japan's vital supply lines to the resource-rich conquered territories of Southeast Asia. Mikawa had to act immediately. Within hours, he'd assembled every available warship at Rabaul: 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a single destroyer. It wasn't much, but Mikawa possessed something the Americans didn't fully appreciate yet. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent years perfecting the art of night combat. While the Americans relied on their new radar technology, the Japanese had developed different tools: powerful searchlights, superior optics, and most importantly, the Type 93 torpedo, known to the Allies as the Long Lance. These oxygen-fueled torpedoes could travel 24 miles at 36 knots, carrying warheads twice the size of American torpedoes. The Americans didn't even know such weapons existed. They were about to find out. Mikawa's scratch force departed Rabaul on the afternoon of August 7th, racing south through the slot between the parallel chains of the Solomon Islands. His plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. He would charge straight into the heart of the American invasion fleet at night, relying on surprise and superior night-fighting skills to devastate the enemy before they could react. The Allied naval forces protecting the Guadalcanal landings should have been more than capable of stopping him. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded the amphibious force, while British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley led the screening force of cruisers and destroyers. They had 8 cruisers and 15 destroyers arranged in a defensive formation around the transport anchorages. The setup looked formidable on paper. 3 groups of warships guarded the approaches to the landing areas. The southern group, with cruisers HMAS Australia, HMAS Canberra, and USS Chicago, patrolled between Savo Island and Cape Esperance on Guadalcanal. The northern group, USS Vincennes, USS Quincy, and USS Astoria, covered the passage between Savo and Florida Island. To the east, USS San Juan and HMAS Hobart provided additional cover. 2 destroyers, USS Blue and USS Ralph Talbot, served as radar pickets to the northwest of Savo Island, positioned to give early warning of any approaching enemy. The Americans had radar. The Japanese didn't. This technological advantage should have made surprise impossible. But technology means nothing if you don't use it properly. On the afternoon of August 8th, an Australian Hudson bomber spotted Mikawa's force heading south. The pilot reported 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 2 seaplane tenders. The identification was wrong. There were no seaplane tenders, but the sighting was real. The warning should have put the entire Allied fleet on maximum alert. It didn't. The report took hours to filter through the command structure. When it finally reached Admiral Turner, he assumed the Japanese were heading for Rakata Bay to set up a seaplane base, not racing toward his fleet for a night attack. No one thought the Japanese would dare attack the superior Allied force in darkness. If you're enjoying this exploration of one of World War II's most shocking naval disasters, hit that like button and subscribe to The Old Breed for more untold stories of military history that shaped our world. As evening fell on August 8th, exhaustion gripped the Allied fleet. The crews had been at battle stations for 2 straight days, fighting off Japanese air attacks while supporting the Marine landings. Men stumbled through their duties in a haze of fatigue. Admiral Crutchley had promised the captains they could stand down to Condition 2, half the crew on watch, once darkness fell. This decision would prove catastrophic. Making matters worse, Admiral Crutchley wasn't even with his force. Turner had summoned him to a conference aboard USS Macaulay, anchored off Guadalcanal. Crutchley took his flagship, HMAS Australia, with him, leaving the Southern Group without its most powerful ship, and without telling Captain Howard Bode of USS Chicago that he was now in tactical command. Bode assumed Crutchley would return shortly and went to bed, leaving instructions not to be disturbed unless the ship was about to engage the enemy. He would sleep through most of the battle. At 2300 hours, the Japanese force entered the passage north of Savo Island. Mikawa's 7 cruisers and single destroyer moved in a perfect column formation, each ship following exactly in the wake of the one ahead. Japanese lookouts, specially trained and selected for their exceptional night vision, scanned the darkness. They had spotted the silhouettes of USS Blue and USS Ralph Talbot long before the American radar detected them. The Japanese column simply steered between the 2 picket destroyers, passing within a few miles of each ship. Neither American destroyer detected them. USS Blue's radar was suffering from interference. Her operator saw something on his scope, but dismissed it as a rain squall. Ralph Talbot's radar was working perfectly, but her exhausted operators failed to recognize the significance of the contacts they were tracking. Mikawa's force ghosted past undetected. At 1:33 in the morning of August 9th, Japanese lookouts spotted ships ahead, the Southern Group. Mikawa ordered a course change to port, bringing his column toward the unsuspecting Allied cruisers. At 1:36, he gave the order, "All ships attack." The first victim was HMAS Canberra. Captain Frank Getting had just returned to Canberra's bridge after checking on his exhausted crew. Most of the ship's guns were unmanned, their crews sleeping at their stations. The ship was making lazy box patterns at 12 knots, following the same predictable course she'd been steering all night. At 1:43, Japanese cruiser Chokai's 24 searchlights illuminated Canberra like a spotlight on a stage. Before anyone could sound general quarters, 24 8-inch shells and several Type 93 torpedoes slammed into the Australian cruiser. The bridge exploded in a chaos of shattered steel and flame. Captain Getting fell mortally wounded. Canberra's main battery never fired a shot. Within minutes, the proud cruiser was a burning wreck, dead in the water with 84 men killed and over 50 wounded. USS Chicago, supposedly in command of the Southern Group, fared little better. A torpedo blew off part of her bow. Captain Bode, finally awakened, became confused and ordered his ship to sail away from the battle, firing at what he thought were enemy ships, but were actually just shadows. He never warned the Northern Group that the enemy had arrived. As Chicago fled southwest, Mikawa's column split. 4 cruisers continued northeast toward the northern group, while 3 swung around Savo Island to attack from the opposite direction. The Allied cruisers were about to be caught in a deadly crossfire. Aboard USS Astoria, Lieutenant Commander William Truesdell was supervising the midnight watch when he saw star shells bursting to the south. Then came the searchlights. Truesdell immediately sounded general quarters, but Astoria's captain, William Greenman, arrived on the bridge convinced they were watching friendly forces firing at Japanese aircraft. "Cease firing!" Greenman shouted. "We're firing on our own ships!" Even as Japanese shells began striking Astoria, Greenman refused to believe they were under surface attack. Precious minutes ticked by before he finally ordered, "Commence firing! Cruise to our starboard!" But it was too late. Chokai's searchlights found Astoria, and Japanese 8-inch shells poured into the American cruiser. The midships area erupted in flames. Turret 2 exploded. The aircraft hangar became an inferno as aviation fuel ignited. Within minutes, Astoria was burning from stem to stern. USS Quincy's agony was even swifter. Lieutenant Commander Chandler had actually spotted the Japanese first, those strange flashes in the darkness that weren't lightning. He'd immediately ordered general quarters, but Quincy's captain, Samuel Moore, arrived on the bridge and, like Greenman, assumed they were watching friendly forces. When Japanese searchlights suddenly bathed Quincy in brilliant white light, Moore still hesitated. He ordered the recognition signals turned on, desperately trying to identify his ship as American. The bridge signal lights had barely begun flashing when Japanese shells began striking home. The first salvo destroyed Quincy's scout planes, spraying burning gasoline across the deck. The second salvo penetrated the bridge, killing nearly everyone there. Captain Moore was cut almost in half by shrapnel. As he died, he gave his last order: "Beach the ship." But there was no one left alive to carry it out. Quincy took hit after hit. Japanese cruiser Tenryu fired torpedoes from one side, while Ioba pounded her with gunfire from the other. The American cruiser managed to fire a few salvos, even scoring hits on Chokai's chart room, but she was fighting 3 enemies at once, with half her guns out of action and fires raging throughout the ship. At 2:10, less than 30 minutes after the battle began, Quincy rolled over and sank, taking 389 men with her. USS Vincennes, the northernmost cruiser and flagship of the northern group, lasted slightly longer but suffered the same fate. Captain Frederick Reefcoal had actually gone to general quarters earlier when aircraft were spotted, but believing the danger had passed, he'd secured from battle stations just before midnight. When the star shells and gunfire erupted to the south, Reefcoal thought Chicago was firing at aircraft. Even when searchlights illuminated his own ship, he believed they were friendly. "Turn those searchlights off of us. We're friendly," he shouted over the radio. The response came in the form of Japanese 8-inch shells smashing into Vincennes' hull. Cruiser Kako alone fired 48 rounds in 6 minutes. Vincennes fought back desperately, her gunners managing to score several hits on Japanese cruiser Kinugasa, but she was caught in a crossfire between multiple enemies. Torpedoes struck her port side. Shells destroyed her fire control systems. The hangar burst into flames. Power failed throughout the ship. At 2:16, Captain Reefcoal ordered abandon ship. Vincennes sank at 2:50, taking 342 men to the bottom. In 37 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy had destroyed 4 Allied heavy cruisers and damaged a destroyer. They had killed 1,077 Allied sailors and wounded 700 more. The Japanese suffered only minor damage to 3 cruisers and lost 37 men. It was the most lopsided surface engagement of the entire Pacific War. As the sun rose on August 9th, the waters around Savo Island were covered with oil, debris, and desperate men. Sharks moved through the survivors, adding to the horror. Many sailors, coated in fuel oil, couldn't be seen in the dark water. Others, badly burned, died before rescue ships could reach them. On Guadalcanal, Marines watched in shock as the transport fleet prepared to withdraw. Admiral Turner, rattled by the disaster and fearing another attack, pulled out his entire force, leaving the Marines stranded with limited supplies. The Japanese had not only won a tactical victory, they'd nearly derailed the entire Guadalcanal campaign on its second day. The Battle of Savo Island exposed critical failures in American naval warfare. The most glaring was the misuse of radar. The United States Navy had placed absolute faith in this new technology, believing it made surprise attacks impossible. But radar was only as good as the humans interpreting it, and exhausted, undertrained operators had failed to recognize enemy contacts or dismissed them as false returns. Communication failures compounded the disaster. When picket destroyers did detect something suspicious, they didn't report it immediately. When the southern group was attacked, they didn't warn the northern group. Ships, just miles apart, might as well have been on different oceans. The lack of night combat training proved devastating. While Japanese sailors had practiced night fighting for years, American crews were unprepared for the chaos and confusion of darkness. Japanese star shells and searchlights turned night into day for their gunners, while American ships fired blindly into the dark. Perhaps most critically, American commanders had underestimated their enemy. They assumed the Japanese wouldn't dare attack a superior force. They assumed Japanese torpedoes had ranges similar to American weapons. They assumed technological superiority would overcome training and experience. They were wrong on all counts. Admiral Mikawa had achieved complete tactical surprise despite being spotted multiple times. His inferior force had shattered the Allied covering force through superior training, aggressive action, and flawless execution. Yet even Mikawa made a crucial error. He withdrew without attacking the defenseless transport fleet, fearing American carrier aircraft would catch him in daylight. Had he pressed his attack, he could have destroyed the invasion's supply ships and truly doomed the Guadalcanal campaign. His caution saved the American strategic position even as his victory humiliated the United States Navy. The aftermath brought recriminations and accusations. Admiral Turner blamed inadequate air cover. Admiral Crutchley faced criticism for leaving his force. Individual captains were accused of cowardice or incompetence. Captain Bode of USS Chicago would take his own life in 1943, unable to live with the shame. But the real failures were institutional. The Navy had not prepared for this kind of warfare. Peacetime training had emphasized daylight battles and underestimated the importance of night combat. Radar had been treated as a perfect solution rather than a tool requiring skilled interpretation. Communication procedures were inadequate for the speed and confusion of modern naval combat. The lessons learned came at a terrible price. Those 1,077 sailors died not just from enemy action, but from their own Navy's failures of training, doctrine, communication, and leadership. Yet, from this disaster came determination. The United States Navy would never again be surprised like this. New training programs emphasized night fighting. Radar operators received intensive instruction. Communication procedures were revolutionized. Combat information centers were developed to coordinate sensor information and tactical decisions. Within a year, American forces would dominate night battles, turning the Japanese advantage into a liability. The same waters that saw humiliation at Savo Island would witness American victories at Cape Esperance, Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, and Tassafaronga. The ghosts of Savo Island had taught the Navy how to fight. Today, few remember the Battle of Savo Island. It lacks the infamy of Pearl Harbor or the glory of Midway. But for the families of those 1,077 sailors, for the survivors who spent hours in shark-infested waters, for the Marines who watched their support fleet abandon them, Savo Island remains a name etched in sorrow. It stands as a reminder that technology alone doesn't win battles, that underestimating an enemy invites disaster, that the price of unpreparedness is always paid in blood. In the deepest part of what sailors call Iron Bottom Sound, that stretch of water between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, 4 Allied cruisers rest in the darkness. USS Quincy lies in 500 fathoms, her hull torn open, her bridge destroyed. USS Vincennes sits upright on the bottom, looking almost intact from a distance until you see the massive torpedo holes in her port side. USS Astoria rests in pieces, her hull broken apart as she sank. HMAS Canberra, scuttled by friendly torpedoes after the battle, lies deepest of all. These ships are more than war graves. They're monuments to the cost of complacency, testimonies to the price of institutional failure. Every navy in the world studies Savo Island, not for its tactics, but for its warnings. The battle proves that superior numbers mean nothing without superior training, that technology without doctrine is useless, that exhausted crews make fatal mistakes, that communication failures cascade into catastrophe. The Japanese victory at Savo Island would prove to be their last major surface victory of the war. They had won through superior training and night-fighting expertise, advantages that would erode as American forces learned and adapted. Within 18 months, American radar-directed gunfire and improved tactics would make night battles the American specialty. But on August 9th, 1942, in those terrible 37 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy had delivered a masterclass in naval warfare while the United States Navy had suffered its most humiliating defeat. The Marines on Guadalcanal, watching burning ships on the horizon and their supply fleet retreating, must have wondered if they'd been abandoned to die. They hadn't been, though it was close. The Navy would return, bloodied but determined. The campaign for Guadalcanal would continue for 6 more months, becoming one of the most brutal of the Pacific War. Every supply run, every reinforcement convoy, every naval battle in those waters would carry the shadow of Savo Island. The Navy had learned that controlling the sea meant more than having the most ships or the best technology. It meant being ready to fight every hour of every day, in darkness or light, exhausted or fresh, surprised or prepared. Did you know that many of the radar operators who survived Savo Island went on to train the next generation of naval personnel, turning their failure into the foundation of future victories? Share this video with someone who appreciates the hidden lessons of history, and subscribe to The Old Breed as we continue uncovering the forgotten battles that changed everything. What other naval disasters do you think taught invaluable lessons? Let us know in the comments below. The waters around Savo Island are calm now. Occasionally, a cruise ship passes through, its passengers unaware they're crossing one of the Pacific's great naval graveyards. The jungle has reclaimed the battlefields of Guadalcanal. The airfield the Marines died to capture is now an international airport. But on quiet nights, when fog rolls in around Savo Island and searchlights from fishing boats sweep across the water, old sailors who served in the Solomons remember. They remember the thunder of guns in the darkness, the screams of dying ships, the oil-covered survivors singing in the water to keep their spirits up while sharks circled. They remember the night the United States Navy learned that wars aren't won by those who assume victory, but by those who prepare for defeat. The night when 37 minutes changed everything. The night of Savo Island, America's worst naval defeat, and perhaps, in the lessons it taught, one of its most important.